I'm Dr. Bob Kelty, and I wanted to give some tips today on gardening and yard work, hopefully avoiding back strain. Back fatigue, strain, and outright injury are a hallmark of yard work and gardening, primarily because of the bending that is performed during many of those tasks. So the worst position for the spine and the weakest is bending forward, wherein we round the lower back. So all activities where we're bending over, reaching down, pushing bent forward are all the weak position for the spine and lead first to fatigue and then to potential injury. There are four principles that are universally applicable to keeping the body and particularly the spine safe, and we're going to talk about that as it applies to yard work and gardening. Principle number one is that the strongest position of the lower back is our standing position with the natural inward curvature or slight hollow to the lower spinal alignment. Throughout all the tasks of yard work and gardening, we'd like to maintain that curvature as much as we can manage to do, and at the very least keep it flat, but the inward curving is actually better. Principle number two is we want to lean, bend, and reach forward, hinging from the hip joint, bending from this point rather than the back, and we want to bend from the hips, and if we bend the knees, that helps to facilitate bending from the hips. But the other concept is if you are pushing your tush backward, that helps the bend from the hips. So as we bend forward, we'd like to bend from the hips, keep the natural curve in the lower back. That's the way we're going to bend and reach as much as we can make practical. The third principle is that as we are bending forward, our body weight is hanging out here unsupported, so if we can carry some of that weight with our hand on our legs, like this, or on the ground or some other object, that's going to be helpful. Principle number four is that when we're rotating, we want to keep the pelvis lined up with the spine, and we want to rotate from the hips. So it's a movement like this, not from the upper body. So let's apply that to some yard work tasks. Raking, we would like to, like with mowing, flex from the hips, use your legs, do all the pushing and pulling from your legs and your hips. And with raking in particular, you don't want to reach too far, because the farther you bend forward, the weaker the back is, and then you're pulling. So this is a bad raking position, or at least high risk. Raking should be short strokes using your hips and your legs, and if you're projecting material this way like brooming, the rotation should come from the hips, not the upper body and the spine. When you're mowing, you want to mow standing upright and keep your hips flexed a little, keep the curve in your back as you're pushing and pulling. You don't want to mow bent forward, especially if you're pulling and tugging to reverse directions. That can get the back into trouble. When we are doing items like trimming and pruning, we can squat. Especially squatting on one knee is useful. And if your legs aren't quite as strong as they used to be, you can use a kneeling and stool device which gives you handles to help push yourself up, which can be useful. And you can use it for both kneeling and sitting. But for trimming and pruning, you can drop on one knee. Then you can elevate to whatever level you might need. Again, hinging from the hips and keeping the low back inward curve. You can lower yourself here, and this allows you this operating range. If you're planting or working in the soil, you can use the same one knee kneel. And here, however, as you're working in the dirt, you need to support your upper body leaning forward by resting your arm on your knee so that you're carrying some of your weight. Now that does somewhat limit your use of this hand, but at least you've got some operational range with it. Most of the digging and soil work and planting would be done with the other arm. Again, you're trying to maximally hinge from the hips. In this case, keep the back as flat as you can manage to and support your weight on your arm. For weeding, here you'd like to use both knees in a kneel, put one hand on the ground, hinge from the hips and keep the low back flat, and this allows you to pull and tug on resistant weeds, and it gives you lots of power. This is the safest position to weed. We certainly don't want to be bending forward this way because the back is rounded, you're unsupported. This will very quickly fatigue and potentially create back injury. So in summary, to make all of this applicable, number one, we want to keep the low back inward curve. We'd like it to be maintained as much of the time as practical, and at the very least keep it flat if we can't keep the inward arch. We'd like to lean, bend, and reach forward, hinging from the hips. So push your tush backward, bend the knees, and that combined with arching the lower back is a really great position, basically a squat. We want to rest our weight whenever possible, carrying the weight with our arms resting on either our legs, knees, or some other object. And lastly, when we rotate, we want to rotate from the hips and legs, keeping the pelvis in line with the spine so the movement looks like this, not rotating the torso. This is Dr. Bob Kelty wishing you a safe gardening and yard work season.